You are now being recorded. And now I will go ahead and pull up our presentation. Yes, please eat. Take care of yourselves, do what you need to do. We're just happy that you're here and that you care enough about learning some of this information. We don't care how you're doing it. So, okay, I see Jennifer, Brianna, and Janet. Can one of you give me a thumbs up if you can see something on the screen? Fantastic. So, we're going to start with some definitions and numbers and that kind of information. So just be aware that, again, this is going to be a lot of content in a short period of time. Please, at any point, feel free to interrupt. So, who are refugees is usually the first question that we get when we start talking about this population. There is a very strict, very official definition of refugees. And most countries base their definition off of the United Nations definition. So, the United Nations Convention in 1951 formed the definition of a refugee that is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted, key phrase, for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, also key point, and it's outside of the country of their nationality and unwilling to or unable to return to their country or avail themselves of the protection of the country. So that well-founded fear phrase is really important because that means they specifically may not have been persecuted, but they have a well-founded fear, a good reason to fear persecution because of their identity. So that's the next little section that talks about race, religion, nationality. It's not just that there's general chaos or general warfare in the country. It has to be that they would be targeted because of their specific identity. The other piece that makes people a refugee is they are outside of their own country. So if you are still in your country, that is going to put you into this other category of an internally displaced person. So you might have all of the same situations, but you have not left the borders of your country. So that is a really important distinction to make. Going back one quick little slide, people are not always considered refugees in a legal status under situations that we think they might be. So people who are not considered refugees are people who have fled their homes, but again, not crossed that international border. And that falls into that internally displaced category. Right now, it's around 40 million. That actually might have gone up since I last checked. People who have left their countries due to violence or environmental disasters, if they're not falling under that category of having a fear of persecution because of who they are not legally, technically a refugee. If you are a part of the persecuting group, you are also not a refugee. This can get complicated because there has certainly been situations where the group of people who are persecuting others moves in between different groups. So a good example of this is Rwanda. So we had Hutu and Tutsis that were kind of pitted against each other, a lot of colonial impact there. But for a while, it was the Hutus persecuting the Tutsis, and the Tutsis were persecuting the Hutus, and it went back and forth. So that can make it really complicated to know who exactly is a refugee at this point in time. If you do not fall into a specific social identity group, then any violence against you would not make you a refugee. And individuals who fear persecution due to gender identity, or LGBTQ, sexual or gender minority status, currently do not fall under the legal definition of a refugee. There are some cases that have been brought to try to expand that definition to cover this group, but currently it is not a part of any of the legal status. So no protection for under the status of a refugee for people in that population group. A couple of other terms just to be aware of. An asylum seeker would be someone who seeks refuge in a second country due to persecution. That could be a couple of different things. In the past, it used to be a lot of, if you could get to the embassy and apply to be an asylum seeker, you might be brought over to the United States under that category. Now what we tend to see is more people who have gotten to a specific country and are requesting to stay in that country because they fall under the categories of being fear of being persecuted because of one of those identities. We also have the undocumented category. People who are in the country without legal permission. They might be applying to be an asylum seeker. They have to do that in the first year that they're there. A couple of maybe more current statuses that you might hear about is coming in under the Afghan immigration statuses. So currently there's three main categories that people might be coming in under. A special immigration visa, so they have worked for the United States government or government contractors in Afghanistan for at least a year. This would also cover their immediate families. We have SQ and SI parolees. Those are people who have a pending status, and humanitarian parolees do not have a specific status, but will likely be seeking asylum in the United States. So, as I said, lots of stuff to throw at you in the beginning. A couple of things that I think are just useful to consider as far as how are refugees vulnerable in general. You'll probably find most, if not all, of these situations in refugee populations that you work with. They've lost their homes and employment. They often lack papers or official documents to show their status, show their training, and to obtain new employment in their field of training. They may be reduced to a single parent family. A lot of the families I've worked with were single mothers with maybe 3 or 4 kids. So often very young children. So they often have multiple children that they need to care for. They often have very few resources available to them. They're often lacking their previous cultural support. So usually in their home country or even in the refugee camp, they will have a lot of the cultural connections. They'll be with other people that speak their language. They understand what is available, even if it's not a whole lot. They have connections to do that. Usually once they arrive in the United States or a resettlement country, they're very overwhelmed very quickly. And it is not unusual that they arrive with poor health or multiple conditions. Healthcare in refugee camps is not great. Some common issues that you're going to see if you're working with folks who have arrived. Language is a huge barrier. As you can all imagine, no surprise there. Transportation is another big issue. So they are not arriving typically with a driver's license. Our bus system is not great. I remember one time we were trying to figure out how to get someone to a dentist appointment who had some English skills, so they actually could maybe take the bus. And they'd been here for a little while. And we figured out that it would take them 4 hours to get from their house to the dentist's office, which is maybe half an hour drive at most if we were driving. So between waiting for buses, transfers, all of that, transportation is definitely not set up to be very helpful for refugees in our country. Employment is often a challenge. Childcare, literacy, poor health, lack of medical knowledge. So especially understanding the systems here as far as how you get assistance for medical issues. Often psychological or trauma factors are going to be involved, and often a lot of fear. So part of what happens when you're a refugee is often your own country has been kind of set against you. So even the people who are supposed to be helpers, such as the police, are often the people who are involved in the persecution while people are in their home countries. So that has a lot of fear of trusting systems here, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. So keep all of that in mind when you are looking at refugees in the population that you might be working with here. I'm going to super quick stop sharing, make sure we don't have anyone waiting to join. And are there any questions so far? Hanging in there? Okay, great. All right. Then back to our presentation. Oh, and it lost my place. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of context, the numbers of refugees, usually when I teach this in a class, I like to play a little guessing game and see if people can guess how many refugees they are. And usually the number is very widely from, oh, maybe 1 million to, oh, maybe 1 billion. And there's kind of a wide range between that. It's about 26.4 million refugees right now. Remember, that is only the people who have met that definition and gone to another country. If you add in the displaced people, that gets up to about 82 million people. So these are large numbers of people. This is not a small group. The refugee resettlement system in the United States has only been in place in its current format since about 1980. Before that, we did not have the resettlement process that we have now. We had some people who might have qualified as refugees under the definition, but we didn't have the system of resettlement to give people support to get here or the specific visa statuses. So we used to resettle about 60 to 85,000 per year. That changed a lot, especially after 9/11. The numbers went down dramatically to about 20,000 a year for a couple of years, kind of worked its way back up. And then with some of the political climates has been really kind of bouncing around a lot. So the caps are set by the president. And you can kind of see a pattern there where at one point it was about 110,000, even though we didn't get that many people actually resettled. The numbers dropped a lot in 18 to about 30,000, down to 18,000 in 20. This year, President Biden has committed to 125,000. So he's bringing that cap back up. However, there's been a lot of issues in getting people through the resettlement screening process. So I don't know if that number is going to reach anywhere close to that now that we have some different situations going on that might change. So I'm hopeful, but we'll see what happens. Most recently, the top 5 countries of origin in Michigan have been Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar or Burma, Eritrea. You also have seen a fair number of Bhutanese, still some Sudanese and Somali. These are kind of the main areas. And usually Michigan gets about 3,000. So about half of those go over to the Detroit area. They have some special contracts for folks from the Middle East. So you'll see a lot of people from Iraq, especially going into that area. And then Grand Rapids and Lansing have typically split the other half of that. Last year, we had 493 folks resettled in Michigan. So again, you can see the numbers are a little bit lower right now. COVID really slowed things down again. Things were starting to pick back up, and then COVID, and yeah, not so much. We have had situations where people were approved for resettlement, and then they passed all of their different screenings. And then when they came to actually come here, they tested positive for COVID, so we're not able to, which sets the whole process back all over again. So a little bit of context for you. Overall, the resettlement process can be kind of messy. Typically, you're screened when you arrive at a refugee camp. So you leave your country, you're usually directed to go to a specific place. So for example, the government of Kenya does not necessarily want just a bunch of people from the Sudan to go anywhere in the country that they want without any status or employment ability, or perhaps taking the jobs of people in Kenya. So they will send them specifically to a location that has been prepared as a refugee camp. And by the way, these pictures are from Kakuma Refugee Camp, where I did my dissertation work in 2011. So you can kind of see a little bit of what it would look like there. Typically, refugees spend about 10 to 15 years average time in the camp before they go to a different location. That can vary a lot. So it could be currently, the Afghan arrivals have not been in a refugee camp. They've been in some detention centers once they got out of their countries, but they have not spent years in a camp. I also met quite a few people when I was in Kakuma that were born in the camp and they were now adults. So there can be a huge variety there. Each country is going to do a separate screening process to determine if they're going to bring them over for resettlement. So someone might apply to be resettled in the United States and Canada and Australia and Sweden, and kind of rotate and see where they can actually get accepted for resettlement. The main reasons why people are accepted for resettlement is they have good fear of being persecuted even in the refugee camp. So there might be some conflicts going on there. So again, that fear of safety. It could be that there are medical conditions that they can't do anything in the camps, but we could do something here. For example, one of the first families I worked with had a son who had cerebral palsy. He was about 10. He definitely needed a wheelchair, did not have access to that in the camps, needed some surgeries, had some cognitive deficits. So that was all stuff that they couldn't really do anything with there. They also had I think he was about 20 when they came over, an adult child who had some severe mental health issues, possibly schizophrenia, never really well diagnosed. That may have also contributed to their ability to come here. So once people are accepted into the refugee resettlement process, there's usually a period of time where they're waiting. And during that point in time, they're going to have some brief cultural orientation. It's not going to be super in-depth. It's just getting people started. Again, for our Afghan arrivals, they are not having that opportunity. So be aware that there are definitely some differences with our new arrivals from Afghanistan. And refugees are assigned to a specific location. They do not get to choose where in the United States they go. So they are going to be told that this is where they're going. So they might have friends from the camp, friends from home, even family members in Minneapolis, but they're going to very likely be resettled here. Often we do see some secondary migration where people will move to a location where they have people that they already know, but that is not necessarily a part of the process in general. Typically under the resettlement process here, you will get 3 months rent, basic needs, case management. The case management will set up your apartment for you. They'll make sure there's basic furnishing, there's food in the house. They'll pick you up at the airport, take you to your house and give you some orientation as to, it's very likely that people from some countries may not have had electricity or plumbing or have a conventional kitchen like we think of. So teaching people how to do that, getting children signed up for school, getting people signed up for benefits, all of that kind of beginning thing. They typically are encouraged to attend English classes as soon as possible. So it's not unusual that within a week or so, they will be going to English classes. They are expected to be able to work as soon as possible. So the time in their English classes might be limited. In some cases, they might get up to 6 months of that kind of services. And it's also important to know that refugees coming under the traditional refugee status have to pay back the cost of their airfare. So one of the first families that I worked with had a family of 9. They got here, they had a $14,000 bill that they had to pay back the day they landed. It was expected that they would pay this back. And it is, spread out over time, but they had 1 working adult for 9 people. And on top of being able to provide for rent and food, they were expected to pay back the cost of their airfare. There are currently 9 national agencies that we call VOLAGs, voluntary agencies. They contract with the United States government to provide resettlement services. And then those 9 larger agencies will subcontract with local agencies. We have 2 in the Grand Rapids area, Bethany Christian Services and Samaritas, previously Lutheran Social Services. So if you've heard that, that's why. Bethany does have quite a few additional programs, and folks from Bethany, correct me if any of this is outdated. There's a counseling program and an employment program for the first 5 years in addition to the resettlement. So people who are coming in through Bethany or Samaritas can automatically join either of those programs if they qualify. There's also a program called the Refugee Education and Cultural Center in town. They do after school tutoring, they do summer programs, and they help the kids kind of get adjusted to school, help with communication through the school systems. There are also a lot of other local churches and programs that offer different kinds of support, typically English classes. There's some churches that do like basic English services. Those are not specifically limited to refugees, but certainly refugees can attend. And the Treetops Collective, which I see I need to edit, I have that in twice, is a cross-cultural movement that seeks to connect with and invest in new American leaders. So trying to broaden that from not just refugees, but people who might have arrived under other forms. And I don't know why that switched. So they are working basically to provide community space for refugees and other new Americans to connect, to find support. They have a lot of groups for supporting some of the folks from this program, from these different groups. And they also do some things like sewing projects and employment for people through that method. The Treetops Collective is also where we're looking to start some, in our language, refugee support groups. It's not going to look exactly like our other more Americanized support groups. So this is just kind of a slide that has a ton of information in one. So again, this might be a good chance if you wanted these slides to be able to get some of this information. So I think it is important to note that less than 1%, so less than 1/4% of refugees are actually resettled. So when we talk about resettlement, that's when people are screened in the camps, they're brought to a third country for permanent residency, such as in the United States. There's also the hope that people might go through what we call repatriation, where they're able to return to their home country, or that they might have integration into the country they're in. So again, for example, the folks who were at the Kakuma refugee camp had some potential to be given status to be in the country of Kenya and to be able to have employment ability and legally to stay there. That is one of the most important things I think we need to know, is that sometimes we think that the United States and the world in general does a great job resettling refugees, and that we take care of them and we bring them all over, and it's really a very small number compared to the number of refugees who exist. In 2019, 29 countries accepted refugees from 60 different countries. And you see in this slide, Syria is also one of the top countries for resettlement, so which kind of makes sense in more recent times. It does make sense also that the number of global resettlement spaces has really decreased in recent years. So it's dropping down quite a bit right now. And just a couple more pieces of information that are more specific to the current situation with Afghanistan. So there's a little bit of history there as far as the Taliban taking territory and people beginning to flee starting in May of this year. And August 15th is when you probably heard in the news about some of the takeovers of the government, and where people really began to flee, when we had people crowding into the planes to try to get out of the country. And August 30th, the military completely withdrew, the United States military. So we have right now evacuated Afghans who are at military bases all around the world, a lot in Europe, some in the United States, and they're doing their medical and security screenings there. So they are still being screened. We're not just bringing over anyone who got out of the country, just like any other immigration status, they're going to go through the screening process. And right now, there are 6 United States military bases. I think the closest one is Indiana or Illinois, where people are staying again to do the medical screenings, immunizations, TB testing. They are applying for employment authorization to work in the United States. And as far as I know, it does look like that part will go through. People are just starting to arrive in Michigan, in Grand Rapids. And again, Bethany folks especially, feel free to jump in with more current information. This is our last slide, and then we'll have a little discussion. So people are starting to arrive in Michigan either on random selection or the presence of a, typically, I believe, a family member who might already be here. Resettlement agencies are implementing the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program, and this is going to look different from our typical refugee resettlement programs. So part of that is going to be because of the specific legal status they have. They don't have refugee status. And these other statuses are not going to allow access to Medicaid, food assistance, and other benefits. So part of what this is going to mean is that people may not have any form of health care. So for people looking at mental health care, they're not going to have the funds to be able to pay to go to therapy. So it's either going to have to be pro bono work or some other system such as the Healing Center if they can take them. The services they will be getting is the 90 days of that case management and placement service where they get picked up at the airport, their food is and housing is set up. They'll have some material assistance. They're going to still enroll them in school, get some cultural orientation, and some legal services to apply to adjust that status. But this situation is going to look really different compared to what we typically have seen in the resettlement process. So, quick looking through our chat to see what I missed. So Jennifer's noting that the Healing Center through Bethany is specific to survivors of torture. So they have a specific criteria that they have to meet, and that is because of the government contract that they have. So it's not open to all refugees or all people coming in as new Americans in general. They have to be very specifically able to show that they are survivors of torture. So that can limit who they can see. They are also involved in a preferred communities program for high medical needs refugees. So it looks like you might want to say a little bit more about that, Jennifer. Just because your face suddenly popped up on the screen.
I finished my food.
Oh, okay.
Just weird timing.
Okay.
Yeah, so you said it perfectly. The Healing Center is specific to that subgroup. However, Bethany is looking at expanding into a general counseling program because the need is so great. And we have a wait list that we'll never get to, which is what everybody has. But Bethany, not only do we have employment for the 5 years, we also have what we call preferred communities, or PC for short, which is those high needs. You know, you talked about that refugee family that had the schizophrenic family member. They might come in, they do the neuro checks, they do medications, they help with the high needs medical side. You know, we had a paraplegic, refugee come in, things like that. So that is available through Bethany as well.
Thank you.
That's all I had to say.
Yeah, great. So I threw a ton of information at you. What are your questions or reactions?
If refugees are not being given the sorry, my son's crying, the cultural lessons, are your host families, or how are they learning that? Or just kind of winging it?
Well, that's kind of what all of them do. Even the people who get the cultural orientation, it's pretty minimal. So once they get here, there's a lot of culture shock, a lot of not understanding what's going on in the community, and unfortunately not a lot of support. So the case managers, from my experience, has been they do as much as they possibly can. But if you have a family who got here yesterday versus a family who got here 6 weeks ago, you're probably going to go visit the family who got here yesterday. So when newer folks arrive, they might not have as much time to spend with people just because the caseloads are high, just like every other part of human services and social work. So we really rely on community members to be involved with these families. That could be a formal support as far as people saying, hey, our church wants to sponsor a refugee family. It could be someone who volunteers just to go over to their house and work on English. It could be someone who says, hey, I want to help with transportation, because that is huge. But that connection with someone from the United States is really, really important, because I mean, imagine if you were suddenly dropped off in the middle of a country where you have no language skills, you don't understand the systems, and no one around you talks to you or even tries to talk to you. Super scary, super intimidating, and there's definitely a tendency to want to be afraid to go out into the world. So we really, really rely on people getting involved and helping out in that way. People do try to stay connected with their own community. For example, we have a huge Congolese community here in Grand Rapids. They have found each other, they have formed their own communities, their own churches. They have bought houses and duplexes where they live together. We've had enough from that specific population, just because I worked with them a lot, that people from other states have actually moved to Michigan to be a part of this community. But still, we also need the people who have grown up here to be able to, extend that welcome and share our experiences and just be that person to answer questions. That was kind of the basis of our whole program. And a lot of what Tree Tots does is just giving people a connection with people here. We also noticed that as far as the mental health piece, and I'm sure Jennifer will probably talk about this in a couple of weeks, the first couple of months that people are here, there's a lot of confusion, but there's still a lot of hope. There's the, once I figure this out, everything's going to be better. In the United States, things are good. We'll be able to send money home to our families. When I was in Kenya, the big rumor in the camp was that Obama gives everyone a house, a job, and a car. So as soon as you get here, you're going to have those three things. Not reality. So that's very difficult for people once they get here to understand that this is not the situation that they thought they were getting into. And it's really about, so like that first 3 to 6 months, people are like excited, trying to figure things out, hopeful. Case management ends, people stop coming to visit, and that's right at the point where people are realizing, oh, this is going to be really hard, and mental health tends to go downhill. There's a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, as you would expect, obviously a lot of trauma, but really people are being cut out of services at the time when they are realizing how hard things are going to be. So that's unfortunate, just part of how the system here is. At least we have a system, which not all countries have, but definitely could use more support than we give to folks. Other questions?
Well, Jessica, you put it perfectly. Just to piggyback on that, with, if you guys know Maslow's hierarchy, when they come in, they want to make sure they have food and shelter, right? And they also are so used to not going without, or so used to going without. So when they get that first couple checks, they're not thinking, even though we keep saying 3 months or 6 months, these are going to stop, they're not thinking that. And so there's a lot of cultural education in one ear and out the other. Not their fault, right?
You can only absorb so much.
Kenya, right? Like, it's survival mode. And so once those checks stop, once those visitations stop, they're like, oh crap, I actually do need this money to pay my rent. Where did it all go? Oh, actually I do. And then it's this, well, you brought me here, why aren't you taking care of me? And then as a society, we see that as entitlement, where it's actually survival for them. So how do we, in our mindset, switch it so that we're helping, assisting them instead of putting on this entitlement lens? So
Yeah.
that's just some food for thought.
One of the papers I actually wrote out that came out of my dissertation interviewing the refugees in Kenya was, we have created this system where people stay in camps for long periods of time, 10, 15, 20 years, and they're only allowed to use what they're given by the agencies involved. So they're not allowed to work. Some people with special skills like teachers or interpreters might get a job, but as far as formal employment, there's not a lot available. You're not allowed to leave the camp and go work legally. Again, people do because survival. You survive on the food you're given. So every 14 days, they got 9 days worth of food. That's just what you dealt with. there weren't other avenues for providing for yourself. And I will say people are very creative and do a lot more than we give them credit for. But in general, you are expected to only survive on what is given to you. So after you do that for 15 years, you're brought to a place and you're told, okay, we're going to pay for things for 3 months and then you're on your own. That doesn't even make sense. The whole system of rent often doesn't even make sense. So we're asking people to make a really big mental shift without having the experience of knowing what any of that looks like. I'm always impressed with how many refugees actually do figure things out after 3 months. Not saying it's easy and that they're getting up to those higher need levels, but I am always impressed with how many people actually can do that. This is probably the most resilient population you will ever work with. Yes, Hannah.
So I'm here to learn as a clinician, as a social worker, but also as an advocate in the community. And so I'm thinking about conversations with other community members. And I'm wondering what might be some things, some helpful responses to people who aren't interested in welcoming refugees, whether it's their political opinion, or some people would argue, there's so many people to help in the United States, why are we helping other countries? What could be some helpful responses?
I'm going to ask Jennifer to piggyback on this, but I'll give it a try. First of all, you're not going to convince some people, right? That's just not going to happen. If people have a little bit of window of trying to understand, one of the things that I often do is kind of go through a little exercise of like, imagine that you lost your home. Imagine that you have been surviving in a little hut and only with 9 days of food every 14 days. Like that is some core basic needs. And some of that is not to that extent here in the United States, not saying that there's no needs here, but that level of need is super high. Add in all the levels of trauma, and that is huge. So I don't have like connections with refugees in my family or anything, right? But just after having met people in this population, I'm like, if there is anyone that deserves help and support, it is these folks. Another piece might be refugee situations in a large part have been formed because of colonialism and the involvement of the United States government and other European countries' governments as well. But in some contexts, we have created the situations that have caused people to be refugees. So if we're going to be involved in things in a worldwide setting in a way that causes these situations to happen, we need to take some responsibility for that. And it's not going to be by sending money there. That's not going to happen. It could be by let's take some of those folks and give them a chance here. So those are the first two things that I think about. Other thoughts from Bethany folks or anyone else?
Something that I've carried over from when I worked with human trafficking is the concept of she's somebody's daughter. So many times when I'm talking with somebody, they already have that I don't want to listen to you in front of them, right? They already have either that political stance or they themselves are hurting and why can't they get help? There's some blockage there for that conversation to be happening. And so I try to, instead of here's this logical list, because they're not in their logical mindset. For those of us who are clinicians, they're over here in their emotional mindset. So I try to then say, if your daughter ran up to my house and banged on the door saying her house was on fire, would I turn her away or would I help her? Because she's human, because she's somebody's daughter, I don't care what race, what age, I don't care if she hit my daughter yesterday outside in the front lawn, I'm going to help her. And so that's there. I try to say, you know, they're already here. They're already on the land. It's not like we're, this sounds cruel, like send them back the way I'm saying it. But I just kind of say, like, they're banging on our door and their house is burning down. And so where is my human heart in helping them? Because I do the same for you if you were banging on my house and your house is burning down. So I try to make it a human to human thing, and appeal to that emotion rather than refugee status, or they don't have money. So, the Good Samaritan story, just different things like that. I try to just get it down to core. And many times they can't fight against that because they're not going to turn a daughter away unless they're cruel and crass. And if they are, they're not going to listen to you anyway. So don't throw your pearl before swine, walk away and call it good.
I like that a lot. That's really helpful. When I used to do like larger presentations at churches and other locations, I would kind of do like a little guided meditation kind of thing, where imagine like you were living your life and having everything, kind of normal and safe. And then one day something happens and you have to pick up your kids and run. And you spend weeks walking across desert to get to another country where they let you stay in this little camp. You don't have much food and you don't have good shelter and your kids don't have education. They have some education, but it's not a great system. And you've been living there for 15 years now. So imagine you were in that situation and then you had the opportunity to go somewhere else. You're going to go somewhere else, and you're going to go somewhere else hoping that people are willing to help you and that you can change that long-term situation. Especially for adults, I see a really big hope for their kids. Like, maybe things are never going to be great for me, but maybe my kids have a chance. So I like to walk them through a little meditation of like, imagine that you just got dropped off here or you just got dropped off in the middle of Kenya, and you don't speak the language and you don't understand the systems and you don't know how to turn a handful of steeds into a cow to pay for your rent. Like, imagine that situation and how much help you might need. So that was not the most eloquent version of it, but I used to kind of run people through that as just a way to get started thinking about what would it actually be like if this happened to us, because it could happen to us. It could happen to friends and family around the world. So I hope that gave you some ideas, Hannah. Good question.
I've got a question. I've been thinking about this for a few weeks now. The media has shown pictures of women in Afghanistan giving up their children to the soldiers, just to give them a chance. What happens with children who are in refugee camps or fleeing on their own without their parents? What does that look like? And
not good. There's a great video called God Grew Tired of Us, and you can get it for free online, that follows a group of the Sudanese Lost Boys, where that is basically what happened. Was a lot of the villages got bombed, the parents were killed, the young women were at home, but the boys were out in the fields. So the boys ran away from the village, started forming little groups, and walked together to get to a resettlement location. So they form their own little groups if they're old enough. They might be taken in, thank you for that link, with other people in the camp. But Jennifer or Alyssa, let me know if you know more about this. I don't know much of what that looks like in camps. Once you get to the United States, there'll be a refugee foster care system, but in the camps, I'm not sure.
I can say a little bit about that from what I know from we have a foster son who is one of the Lost Boys. And what we learned from him was that typically they would join up with other groups where there might be, I mean, they talk about being related to everybody, but like a cousin, an uncle, someone who's just a little bit older, so that they have someone they can kind of look up to in their group. But there was very much a sense of, for their parents, like being torn between, like, if they left, they lost their land. And so the parents stayed, and yet they knew that the only hope for their children was for them to get an education and to actually leave. And so, like, I can't imagine as a parent, like, knowing that my only hope for my child is to basically send my child away. And that's the choice that they made. And then this might be helpful too, but like, so in our son's experience, like once they were in the camp at the UNHCR would send out periodically, they would send messages. They were required like that. I think the Red Cross helped with this. They would send messages back to the area they were, trying to contact parents to basically say, is it safe for them to return? And they're required to do that a certain number of times before then they're considered for resettlement. And so in their case, they didn't ever get any response at all. I think they were there 8 years. And so they were eventually resettled here. And actually, I think it was like 3 years after getting here, through a long, convoluted, like this person knows this person knows this person. Our son actually got a call from his mom, who is still alive back in Sudan. So it's wild.
Yeah. And when you talk about finding someone older, it might be the 7-year-old following an 11-year-old.
Exactly.
So it's not like it's an adult or even like an 18, 20-year-old. It might be literally like a 10, 11-year-old who just happens to be a little bit older. And that's someone to look up to and follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for your responses.
All of these systems, I will say, it's very political and very messy. So you're not going to find the same situations or the same clear-cut answers across the board anywhere. The Sudanese Lost Boys had some advantages. They did. They were young, they were healthy, they were able to form those community groups. Whereas you might not find that same situation if you had a group of unaccompanied minors coming from Bhutan or somewhere else. And there's a lot of politics involved in all of this too, where I've noticed that once there's a lot of media attention on a certain situation, we are much more likely to take in a higher number of people from that population. I think that's exactly what happened with the Lost Boys. So there's a lot of messiness and not a lot of clear answers for some of this.
I don't know if you're planning on addressing this, Jessica, but I think one of the other things that I know we struggled a lot with, and I mean, our son's been here 20 plus years, and this is still true, is the stress and pressure that they face, that refugees face coming here to still be supporting family back home. And I mean, you talked about the expectation. There's, all these tales about, they must be like rolling in money here in the US because that's how they view the US. And yet there's something really admirable about like that collective sense of well-being and their sense of responsibility for caring for family back home. And I mean, there were times that we had to like talk to our son and say, and it will do you no good in the future to be able to help them if you don't care for yourself here now. I mean, that's a really difficult thing to try and manage for them and for people who are trying to support them, I think.
Absolutely. I'm guessing Jennifer might talk about that a little bit more in a couple of weeks, but we do often have, especially in that first couple of months when people's rent is paid for and they're getting a small allowance, they'll send the whole thing back to people that are either in their home country or the refugee camp. So then they're not able to start that savings to actually pay for the rent when that time comes up. And that becomes a really big issue. I don't think the people in the other countries understand the level of pressure and finances that are involved here. They hear, oh, you're in a safe place. Oh, you have a job. Maybe you even have 2 jobs. You must be able to send us $1,000. And that's just not reality, as you all know. Especially for those of you who are students, how many of you could just send off $1,000 to someone in another country just because you had extra?
It also sets a really bad precedence that first 3 months if they're sending home $5, $8, $1,000, and then all of a sudden that stops.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had so many clients crying in my office because they're like, the pressure is unbelievable. Of they must be rolling in money here in the United States.
And it might not just be one person asking, it might be 10 different family members, extended family, community members, friends, all calling you up saying, my mom needs surgery. We don't have money for food this month. And when you have food, and you are sheltered, it's hard to say no to someone who's like, yeah, my kid might die if you don't send me money for food. So it's a lot of pressure, absolutely. And I don't have a good answer for how to fix that. I don't think there is one. I think it definitely needs to be acknowledged, but there's no good answer. Any final thoughts or questions? All right, so a couple of things just to know about in the community. We're going to do this Lunch and Learn series for at least the next 3 months, and we're going to continue to rotate through 4 topics. So we'll do this Refugee 101 again in about a month. Next week, we're going to be looking at working with interpreters. And then Jennifer Roberts is going to come and talk about a little more specifically mental health work with refugees. She's a therapist who's been working with refugees and human trafficking survivors for a long time. So she will add lots of expertise to that. And then we're going to do one on Afghan culture. And we're just going to rotate through those 4 different things for the next couple of months so that people will have different opportunities to join in. Every conversation is going to be a little different too. So, and we might even have different people presenting on different things. So I think there's going to be a lot of value to joining in different conversations along the way. If you are, and there's a flyer for that, if you did not join us here because you've seen the flyer, please let me know and I'll get it to you. We are also working on collecting names of therapists in the community who are willing to work with refugees. Janet is one of our folks that is kind of helping guide that project and collecting information. So we actually have a little Google form that if you are in a community or a private practice or an agency where you or other therapists are willing to work with refugees, we will send you that information as well. And thank you, Jennifer. And we would love to get that out into the community more so we can get a bigger list. So like Jennifer said, she has a huge long waiting list of people that need mental health treatment and we don't know where to send them to. If you call people up, they're like, yeah, that's not a client setting I'm comfortable with, or, oh, I'm booked. And that especially gets complicated when you're looking at 2 things. One, most refugees end up with Priority Health Medicaid because that works best in the medical healthcare system. But I don't know any therapists that are taking clients with Priority Health Medicaid right now. Add in the cost of interpreters, and a lot of folks, if you're in private practice and you are doing pro bono work and now you have to pay for an interpreter, you're actually in the hole. Even if you have Medicaid, you might end up with $10 at the end of the day. So it's hard to find people who are willing to do that. So if you or anyone you know is willing to work with people from this population, might be new Afghan arrivals, it might be a refugee family that's been here for 5 years. Please let us know, and I would be happy to get that link out to all of you. I don't have it right with me. I should have done that, but I will type in my email real quick.
And you said the next meeting was going to be in a month, or is it like every Wednesday?
It's every Wednesday. So the next time we do this topic will be in a month, but next week, Wednesday, is when we're going to start talking about interpreters.
And the same time?
Same time, same link.
Okay. All right.
So please spread the word. Please share the flyers. And we would love to have some of you join us in other sessions. And I will let you go since I know a lot of you are running to 1 o'clock appointments. So have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.